The morning sun rose over New Geneva Colony like it had every day for the past 37 years. Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of the administration building, watching the city come alive below him. Haven Ridge stretched out in old directions, its clean white buildings gleaming in the golden light of Kepler 442b's star. 2.5 million people called this world home now, and Jake had helped build it from nothing more than empty plains and distant mountains. Dr. Lisa Carter was already at work in the medical center when the first ships appeared in the sky. She was treating a construction worker who had fallen from a scaffold when her assistant ran into the room, pointing toward the windows. Lisa looked up to see dark shapes moving across the clouds, bigger than anything humans had ever built. The ships were black as space itself, with strange curves that hurt to look at for too long. The colony's defense grid came online automatically when the alien vessels entered the atmosphere. Captain Nick Sullivan was in the command center within minutes, his fingers dancing across control panels that had never been used for anything more serious than asteroid deflection. The weapon systems were basic, designed to handle pirates or small raiding parties, not the massive fleet that now filled their sky. Jake received the first communication at exactly 9:15 in the morning. The alien voice that came through the speakers was harsh and mechanical, translated by computers that struggled with the strange language. The message was simple and terrifying. The creatures called themselves the Zephyrian Collective, and they claimed Kepler 442b as their ancestral territory. All humans had 24 hours to evacuate or face extinction. The colony had no ships capable of evacuating even a fraction of its population. Their fastest vessels could barely reach the outer planets of the system, much less carry people back to Earth 47 light-years away. Jake tried to negotiate, explaining that humans had been on this world for decades, but they had built cities and farms and families here. The alien commander, who identified himself as War Commander Vector, was not interested in discussion. Amy Brooks was leading a school group through the botanical gardens when the bombardment began. She was showing the children native plants that had been modified to grow alongside Earth crops when the first plasma beam struck the government district. The explosion was visible from across the city, a column of fire that reached into the sky. Amy grabbed the nearest children and ran toward the emergency shelters, her teacher training taking over as panic spread through the streets. The orbital bombardment was unlike anything from human history. The alien weapons struck with surgical precision, targeting power plants, communication arrays, and military installations first. Captain Sullivan watched helplessly as his defense platforms were destroyed one by one, their shields lasting only seconds against the devastating alien fire. The colony's proud skyline began to crumble, as building after building disappeared in brilliant flashes of light. Dr. Carter found herself treating burns and radiation sickness within hours of the attack beginning. Her medical center was overwhelmed with casualties, and she had to make terrible decisions about who could be saved and who was beyond help. The colony's automated medical systems tried to assist, but they had never been programmed for this level of destruction. She worked for 18 hours straight, her hands steady, even as the building shook from nearby explosions. Jake Morrison tried to maintain communications with the outer settlements, but the alien ships were systematically destroying every transmitter on the planet. One by one, the farming communities, mining outposts, and research stations went silent. He realized with growing horror that the Zephyrians were not just attacking Haven Ridge, but were methodically exterminating every human presence. On Kepler-442b, the military bases fell on the second day. Captain Sullivan had moved his remaining forces to hardened bunkers in the mountains, but even underground installations could not withstand direct hits from orbital weapons. He lost contact with most of his units within hours, leaving him with only a few dozen soldiers and whatever weapons they could carry. The colony's proud defense force, which had seemed so impressive during training exercises, was reduced to small bands of survivors hiding in caves. Amy Brooks gathered as many children as she could find and led them toward the mining tunnels in the Meridian Mountains. The underground passages were the only places that seemed safe from the orbital bombardment, though she knew it was only temporary safety. She carried Emma Morrison, Jake's 8-year-old daughter, while other adults helped the older children navigate the dark tunnels. Behind them, Haven Ridge burned with fires that could be seen from space. The Zephyrian ground forces landed on the third day. Dr. Carter got her first look at the aliens when a patrol entered her makeshift medical station in the mountain caves. They were tall creatures, nearly 8 feet in height, with scaled skin and eyes like black marbles. Their weapons were sleek energy rifles that could burn through rock, and they moved with the confidence of predators who had never known defeat. She hid behind surgical equipment as they searched the area, their harsh voices echoing in the cavern. Jake Morrison found himself the leader of 1,500 desperate people hiding in a network of abandoned mining tunnels. The colony's other leaders were either dead or missing, leaving him to make impossible decisions with no good options. Food was running low, medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and the constant fear was breaking down the social bonds that had held the community together for decades. Captain Sullivan organized the remaining security forces into small raiding parties, hoping to strike at Zephyrian supply lines and rescue scattered survivors. But every mission seemed to end in disaster, with good people dying for minimal gains. The aliens seemed to anticipate every move, as if they understood human tactics better than humans did themselves. His best soldiers, men and women he had trained for years, were dying in alien ambush that left no survivors. The bombardment continued for weeks, reducing the once beautiful colony to rubble and ash. The Zephyrians were not content with simple conquest. They were reshaping the very atmosphere of the planet, making it toxic to human life. Dr. Carter detected the first signs of atmospheric poisoning in the children, whose smaller bodies were more vulnerable to the changing air composition. She calculated that they had perhaps 6 weeks before the atmosphere became unbreathable for humans. In the deepest tunnels of the Meridian Mountains, the last survivors of New Geneva Colony huddled together in the darkness, listening to the sound of alien ships passing overhead and wondering if anyone in the vast universe even knew they were still alive. 3 weeks after the Zephyrian attack began, the food synthesizers in the mountain caves started failing one by one. Dr. Lisa Carter watched the machines spark and die, their delicate components damaged by the constant vibrations from orbital bombardment above. The survivors had been rationing their emergency supplies since the first day, but even with strict controls, they were running out of everything that kept people alive. Jake Morrison stood before the gathered colonists in the main cavern, trying to project confidence he did not feel. 1,500 people looked at him with hollow eyes and gaunt faces, waiting for answers he could not give. Children cried from hunger while their parents held them close, whispering promises that everyone knew might be lies. The air in the caves was growing thick and stale despite the ventilation systems that still functioned, and the smell of too many people living in too small a space was becoming overwhelming. The medical supplies were nearly gone, and Dr. Carter found herself treating more cases of radiation poisoning every day. The Zephyrian weapons had contaminated large areas of the planet's surface, and even the deep caves were not completely safe from the invisible killer. She used her last antibiotics on a young mother named Rachel who had been exposed during a desperate search for food in the ruins above. The woman died anyway, leaving behind twin babies that other colonists would have to care for with resources they did not have. Van Hayes, who had been head of colonial security before the attack, began questioning Jake Morrison's leadership openly. He stood in the central cave surrounded by angry colonists, his voice echoing off the stone walls as he demanded answers. Why had they not received warning of the alien fleet? Why were their defenses so weak? Why had Earth abandoned them to die on this distant world? Jake had no good answers to these questions, and he could see doubt spreading through the crowd like a disease. Engineer Kate Williams formed her own group of survivors, who believed they should try to reach the old mining equipment in the deeper tunnels. She argued that they could use the heavy machinery to dig new escape routes or even build weapons to fight the aliens. Her followers included many of the younger colonists who were tired of hiding in the darkness while their world burned above them. The community that had once worked together to build a new civilization was fracturing into desperate factions. Captain Nick Sullivan led another raid on a Zephyrian supply convoy, hoping to capture food and medical equipment for the survivors. He took 12 of his best remaining soldiers, including Sergeant Dan Foster and Corporal Lucy Adams, into the radioactive wasteland that had once been fertile farmland. The mission seemed successful at first, with the humans managing to destroy 2 alien vehicles and scatter their escort, but it was a trap. The Zephyrians had been waiting for exactly this kind of desperate attack. Hidden forces surrounded the human raiders, cutting off their escape routes with energy weapons that turned rocks to glass and metal to vapor. Sullivan watched helplessly as his soldiers died one by one, their screams echoing across the poisoned landscape. He barely escaped with 2 wounded survivors, leaving behind the bodies of people he had trained and fought alongside for years. Amy Brooks tried to keep the children calm and occupied in the deepest parts of the cave system, but their questions were becoming harder to answer. Emma Morrison, Jake's daughter, asked why the Sky people wanted to hurt them, and Amy found herself struggling to explain hatred and war to an 8-year-old mind. The other children were showing signs of severe stress, with nightmares and violent outbursts becoming common even among the youngest survivors. Dr. Carter discovered that the atmospheric changes were accelerating faster than she had initially calculated. The Zephyrians were not just making the air toxic, they were fundamentally altering the planet's entire ecosystem. Plants were dying across the surface, and even the underground water sources were becoming contaminated with alien chemicals. She revised her estimates downward, realizing they might have only 4 weeks before the atmosphere became completely unbreathable for human lungs. The constant fear and desperation began breaking down the social structures that had held the colony together for decades. People accused neighbors of hoarding food or taking more than their share of clean water. Fights broke out over sleeping spaces and access to the remaining medical supplies. Jake Morrison found himself mediating disputes that would have been unthinkable in the peaceful community they had built on the surface. Food became so scarce that hunting parties ventured onto the radioactive surface despite the obvious dangers. Most never returned, and those who did brought back contaminated game that made people sicker than eating nothing at all. The children were weakening visibly, their small bodies unable to cope with malnutrition and stress. Parents made impossible choices about which child to give the last clean water to, decisions that would haunt them for whatever remained of their lives. Captain Sullivan realized that his remaining forces were no match for the Zephyrian hunting parties that systematically swept through the mountain regions. The aliens seemed to know exactly where humans were hiding, as if they had technology that could track heat signatures through solid rock. Every time the survivors thought they had found a secure location, alien soldiers would appear with their terrible energy weapons and force them to flee deeper into the caves. The communications equipment was completely destroyed, leaving the colony isolated from Earth and any other human settlements in the galaxy. Ryan Clark, the surviving communications specialist, tried to rebuild basic transmitters from salvaged parts, but without proper components, his efforts were useless. The survivors had no way to call for help, no way to let anyone know they were still alive, no way to warn other human colonies about the Zephyrian threat. On the 27th day after the attack began, Jake Morrison made the hardest decision of his life. Gathering the surviving leaders in his makeshift office, he quietly discussed the possibility of ending their suffering before the aliens could capture and torture them. Dr. Carter still had enough drugs to make death quick and painless for everyone, including the children. The discussion was conducted in whispers, but word spread through the caves anyway, and many colonists agreed it was better than dying slowly from poison or alien experimentation. The last survivors of New Geneva colony prepared for what seemed like their final night, listening to the sound of Zephyrian ships hunting overhead and wondering if anyone in the universe would ever remember that they had tried to build something beautiful on this distant world. Ryan Clark was working alone in the deepest part of the cave system when he heard the impossible signal. The communications specialist had been trying to build a basic transmitter from salvaged parts for weeks, hoping against hope that he might reach another human settlement somewhere in the galaxy. His makeshift equipment was crude and barely functional, cobbled together from mining computers and emergency beacons that had survived the orbital bombardment above. The signal came through the static at exactly midnight, colony time. At first, Ryan thought it was just interference from the Zephyrian ships that constantly patrolled overhead, but there was something different about this transmission. It was too regular, too precise to be random noise. He adjusted his improvised receivers and listened more carefully, his heart beginning to race as he recognized the mathematical patterns. Hidden in the static. The message was encrypted with current human military codes, the kind of security protocols that were updated monthly by Earth Command. Ryan had memorized these codes during his training years ago, but he had never expected to use them on this distant colony world. His hands shook as he fed the signal through his decryption software, watching meaningless noise transform into words that changed everything. The decoded message was brief and direct, transmitted on a tight beam from somewhere at the edge of the star system. It carried the authentication signature of Admiral Patricia Stone, one of the highest-ranking officers. In the Terra Defense Force, Ryan read the words 3 times before he allowed himself to believe them. Hold position. Cavalry incoming. Maintain minimal electronic signature. Liberation in 72 hours. Ryan ran through the dark tunnels toward the main cavern, his flashlight beam dancing wildly off the rough stone walls. He burst into the central area where Jake Morrison was meeting with the other surviving leaders, interrupting a quiet discussion about the final doses of medicine that Dr. Carter had prepared. The men and women looked up at him with expressions of exhaustion and despair, expecting another report of systems failing or people dying. Jake Morrison listened to Ryan's breathless explanation with growing disbelief. Earth was 47 light years away, and even the fastest human ships would need months to travel that distance. The colony had been under attack for less than 4 weeks, barely enough time for news of their situation to reach the nearest human outpost. Admiral Stone was commanding the defense of the core worlds, not leading rescue missions to distant colonies that everyone assumed were already dead. Dr. Carter examined the decoded message on Ryan's portable display, her medical training making her naturally suspicious of information that seemed too good to be true. The encryption looked genuine, and the transmission protocols matched everything she remembered from her brief military service before joining the Colonial Medical Corps. But the timing made no sense, and she wondered if the Zephyrians had somehow learned to mimic human communication codes to flush out the last survivors. Captain Sullivan was the most skeptical of the group, having lost too many soldiers to alien traps and false hopes. He pointed out that the Zephyrians had demonstrated advanced technology and tactical intelligence throughout their attack on the colony. Creating a fake rescue message would be exactly the kind of psychological warfare that a sophisticated enemy might use to break the morale of desperate survivors, but Ryan Clark insisted that the signal was real, that the encryption was too complex and too current for aliens to duplicate. He explained that the transmission had come from the outer edge of the star system, beyond the orbit of the gas giant where human ships would naturally drop out of faster-than-light travel. The signal was weak and carefully directed, exactly what he would expect from a stealth reconnaissance probe gathering intelligence before a major military operation. Amy Brooks listened to the debate with growing excitement, hope flickering in her chest for the first time since the attack began. She thought about the children hiding in the deeper caves, including Emma Morrison and the orphan twins whose mother had died from radiation poisoning. These children had lived through weeks of terror and despair, and the possibility of rescue seemed almost too wonderful to imagine. The news spread through the survivor community faster than Jake Morrison could control it. Whispered conversations echoed through the tunnels as 1,500 desperate people tried to decide whether to believe in salvation or prepare for another cruel disappointment. Some colonists fell to their knees in prayer, while others argued that hope would only make their final hours more painful when the rescue failed to materialize. Ben? Hayes gathered his faction of angry survivors and demanded to know why Jake had hidden this information from them. He accused the colony administrator of keeping secrets and making decisions that affected everyone without consulting the community. The confrontation grew heated as more people crowded into the central cavern, their voices rising in argument and desperate questioning. Kate Williams and her group of engineers began discussing how they might signal the approaching rescue fleet, assuming it actually existed. They talked about building powerful transmitters or even venturing onto the surface to create visible signals that human ships could detect from orbit. The technical challenges seemed insurmountable, but for the first time in weeks, people were planning for a future beyond the caves. Meanwhile, the Zephyrian forces above continued their systematic hunt for the remaining humans. War Commander Vector had grown frustrated with the resilient pockets of resistance that kept appearing throughout the mountain regions. He ordered the deployment of atmospheric incendiary weapons designed to burn the oxygen out of underground spaces, forcing any survivors into the open where they could be eliminated once and for all. Dr. Carter worked frantically to treat the newest cases of atmospheric poisoning as the alien terraforming process accelerated around them. The air in the caves was becoming thinner and more toxic with each passing hour, and she knew that rescue would have to come soon or there would be no one left to save. She prepared stimulants and oxygen concentrators, hoping to keep the weakest survivors alive long enough to see if the impossible message was real, unknown to the desperate humans hiding in their underground refuge. Advanced reconnaissance drones had been observing their position for the past week. These tiny machines, no larger than insects, fed tactical information to an approaching fleet that represented the full fury of humanity unleashed. The Terra Defense Force had received word of the attack on Kepler 442B through a single courier drone that had somehow escaped the initial assault, and their response was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, Ryan Clark maintained, his vigil over the improvised communications equipment, listening for any additional signals that might confirm or deny the message that had given 1,500 people their first taste of hope in nearly a month. The first sign that everything had changed was the silence. Dr. Lisa Carter was treating a young boy with radiation sickness when she noticed that the constant humming sound from above had stopped. For weeks, the Zephyrian atmospheric processors had filled the air with their alien noise, a deep vibration that seemed to come from the planet itself. Now there was nothing but the natural sounds of wind and settling rock. Jake Morrison felt the electromagnetic pulse as a tingling in his bones, followed by the sudden failure of every electronic device in the cave system. Emergency lights went dark, communication panels died, and even the simple digital watches that some colonists wore stopped working completely. The pulse was so powerful that it seemed to reach into the deepest parts of the mountain, affecting technology that should have been protected by tons of solid rock. Ryan Clark watched his improvised communication equipment spark and fail, but he was not disappointed. He recognized the signature of a military-grade electromagnetic weapon, the kind used by human warships to disable enemy systems before an attack. The pulse had been precisely calibrated to destroy alien technology while leaving basic human electronics repairable, a level of technical sophistication that suggested the approaching fleet was far more advanced than anything the colonists had. Imagine. Captain Nick Sullivan led a small group to the cave entrance they used for observation, carrying crude periscopes made from salvaged mirrors and metal tubing. What he saw through those improvised instruments changed his understanding of human military capability forever. The sky above Kepler 442b was filled with massive shapes that had not been there an hour before, dark vessels that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The human fleet that emerged from hyperspace was unlike anything in the colonial defense manuals. 6 enormous warships dominated the formation, each one larger than the biggest Zephyrian vessels that had terrorized the colony for weeks. These were not the simple patrol boats and cargo haulers that protected most human settlements, but weapons of war designed for a single purpose: the complete destruction of enemies who threatened human lives. Admiral Patricia Stone stood on the bridge of the flagship TDF Retribution, studding tactical displays that showed every Zephyrian position on the planet below. Her fleet had been traveling for 3 weeks at maximum speed, pushing their new hyperspace engines beyond safe limits to reach the besieged colony in time. The ships under her command represented years of secret military development, weapons, programs that had been hidden from both human, civilians, and alien observers. War Commander Thektar received the first reports of human ships with disbelief that quickly turned to concern. His own fleet had seemed overwhelming when it arrived to claim this world, but the vessels now entering the system were clearly built for war rather than exploration. He ordered his forces to attack formation, confident that Zephyrian technology would prove superior to anything these primitive humans could deploy. The first exchange of weapons fire lasted exactly 17 seconds. The Zephyrian plasma cannons that had easily destroyed colonial defenses struck human shield barriers and simply vanished, their energy absorbed and redirected by technology that seemed to mock the laws of physics. In response, the human weapons reached across impossible distances and turned Zephyrian orbital platforms into expanding clouds of superheated gas. Amy Brooks gathered the children in the deepest part of the cave system as the mountain began to shake from explosions in orbit above them. She held Emma Morrison close while other adults tried to comfort the crying youngsters, all of them uncertain whether the battle raging overhead would bring salvation or simply different destroyers. The sound of weapons fire echoed through the rock like thunder that never ended. The Zephyrian fleet attempted to retreat, after losing half their number in the first exchange, but Admiral Stone had positioned her forces to prevent any escape. Human destroyers appeared throughout the star system, their advanced sensors tracking every alien vessel that tried to flee. The Zephyrians found themselves trapped in a carefully planned killing field with no way out except through weapons that could tear apart matter at the subatomic level. Dr. Carter felt the cave system shake as orbital strikes began hitting the planet's surface with surgical precision. But these were not random bombardments like the Zephyrian attacks had been. Every explosion seemed carefully targeted, eliminating alien ground installations while leaving areas near known human survivor locations completely untouched. The accuracy was both terrifying and beautiful to witness. War Commander Thektar tried to negotiate as his forces were systematically destroyed around him. He broadcast offers of withdrawal, promises to leave human space forever, even threats to execute human prisoners if the attack continued. Admiral Stone's response came in the form of targeted strikes that eliminated every Zephyrian command post on the planet while leaving the structures around them intact. Ground forces began landing before the orbital battle was even finished. These were not ordinary Marines but soldiers in powered armor that moved like something from a science fiction dream. Colonel Grace Turner led the first wave of Terra Defense Commandos, their weapons and equipment so advanced that they seemed to come from a civilization decades ahead of the peaceful colony that had been destroyed weeks earlier. Major Steve Rogers coordinated the ground assault from an armored command vehicle that had no trouble navigating the radioactive wasteland the aliens had created. His forces moved through Zephyrian defensive positions like ghosts, their armor protecting them from energy weapons while their own firearms simply erased enemy soldiers from existence. The alien hunting parties that had terrorized human survivors for weeks were eliminated in minutes. Captain Sullivan watched through his periscope as human soldiers approached the cave entrance, their armor gleaming despite the toxic atmosphere outside. He recognized military insignia and human body language, but everything else about these rescuers seemed impossibly advanced. These were not the same humans who had built peaceful colonies and traded carefully with alien civilizations, but something far more dangerous that had been hidden beneath the surface. Jake Morrison led the other survivors toward the cave entrance, as human voices called out in English, offering medical aid and safe evacuation. Behind them, the children of New Geneva Colony emerged from the darkness where they had hidden for nearly a month, blinking in the light of human technology that had come to save them. Above their heads, the sky continued to burn with the fury of a species that had finally revealed its true nature to a galaxy that had underestimated the depths of human wrath. The liberation of New Geneva Colony was complete within 18 hours of the human fleet's arrival. Jake Morrison stood in what had once been the central plaza of Haven Ridge, watching automated construction drones rebuild his city from nothing but ash and memory. The machines worked with impossible speed and precision, following blueprints that seemed to appear from nowhere, as they restored buildings that had been completely destroyed by Zephyrian bombardment. Dr. Lisa Carter found herself in a medical facility that was better equipped than anything the colony had possessed before the attack. Human medics treated radiation poisoning with drugs she had never seen, healing damage that she had thought was permanent with technology that seemed like magic. The children recovered first, their small bodies responding to treatments that reversed weeks of slow poisoning and malnutrition. Admiral Patricia Stone met with the surviving colonists in a temporary shelter that had been erected overnight. She was a stern woman with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much war, and when she spoke about the attack on Kepler 442b, her voice carried anger that made the air itself seem dangerous. She explained that New Geneva had been one of 17 human colonies attacked simultaneously by the Zephyrian Collective in what was meant to be a coordinated strike against human expansion. The aliens had made a terrible mistake in their calculations. They had studied human colonies and trade ships for years, observing what appeared to be a peaceful species with limited military capability. What they had not seen were the secret shipyards hidden in asteroid fields throughout human space, or the weapons research facilities that had been preparing for exactly this kind of war for decades. Jake Morrison learned that Earth had been expecting an alien attack for over 50 years. The friendly diplomatic missions and peaceful trade agreements that characterized human contact with other species were carefully maintained facades, designed to hide the true extent of human military development. Every colony that seemed defenseless was actually monitored by hidden sensor networks, and every trade route was patrolled by warships disguised as cargo vessels. Captain Nick Sullivan was offered a position in the new Colonial Defense Corps, a military organization that was being formed from the survivors of the attacked colonies. He accepted immediately, driven by memories of the soldiers he had lost to Zephyrian ambush and the weeks of helpless hiding in mountain caves. The recruitment officer who briefed him explained that humanity was done pretending to be weak and harmless. The Zephyrian Collective had been completely destroyed as a military force. Their homeworlds were under human occupation, their fleets scattered or annihilated, and their government had surrendered unconditionally after witnessing what human weapons could do to entire star systems. Admiral Stone showed the colonists recordings of alien cities being evacuated ahead of human advances, populations fleeing in terror from a species they had thought was prey. Dr. Carter began treating trauma that went far beyond physical injuries. The children of New Geneva had witnessed horrors that would shape their entire lives, and she found herself struggling to help young minds process experiences that no human should ever endure. Emma Morrison, Jake's daughter, drew pictures of ships falling from the sky and asked questions about why some people wanted to hurt others for no reason. Amy Brooks accepted a position with the expanding Human Diplomatic Service, but the job description was very different from anything that had existed before the war. Human diplomats were no longer negotiating trade agreements and cultural exchanges, but delivering ultimatums to alien governments and enforcing the new reality of human dominance in their sector of the galaxy. The peaceful teacher who had led children through botanical gardens was being trained to carry messages that could determine the fate of entire civilizations. The colonists discovered that their ordeal had been broadcast throughout human space as it happened. Hidden surveillance equipment had recorded every moment of the siege, and the footage of human families hiding in caves while aliens hunted them had united the species in a way that centuries of peaceful cooperation never could. The children, who had cried from hunger in the darkness, were now symbols of human resilience. Their suffering transformed into propaganda for a war that was reshaping the galaxy. Construction of the new Haven Ridge proceeded at an incredible pace, but the city that emerged from the ruins was fundamentally different from what had been destroyed. Defense installations were built into every building, and civilian structures were designed to withstand orbital bombardment. The beautiful parks and open spaces that had characterized the original colony were replaced by hardened bunkers and weapon emplacements disguised as public art. Ryan Clark found himself recruited into military communications, his improvised equipment during the siege having impressed human intelligence officers who had been monitoring his transmissions. He learned that every word spoken in the caves had been recorded by surveillance devices so small they were invisible to human eyes, and that rescue forces had known the exact location and condition of every survivor throughout the siege. Jake Morrison walked through the memorial park that had been built where the old government center once stood. 2 million names were carved into black stone walls that reflected the light of Kepler 442b's star, and fresh flowers appeared every day, though no one ever saw who placed them there. Admiral Stone had told him that similar memorials were being erected on every human world, reminders of what happened when someone tried to prey upon humanity. The new colony was officially opened 6 months after the rescue, but it would never be the same peaceful community that had been destroyed by alien aggression. The children who had hidden in caves grew up knowing that their species was the most dangerous predator in known space, and that the friendly traders and explorers they had learned about in school were just one face of a civilization that could burn worlds when threatened. Ben Hayes and Kate Williams were among the colonists who chose to remain on Kepler 442b, but others requested transfer to more secure worlds deeper in human space. The trauma of the siege had broken some people beyond repair, and they could not bear to live under skies where alien ships had once hunted their children. Dr. Carter remained to treat them, understanding that some wounds never heal but can only be managed. As the human fleet prepared to depart for other war zones, Jake Morrison stood once again on an observation deck overlooking his city. Haven Ridge gleamed in the morning sun as it always had, but now he knew that beauty was protected by weapons that could sterilize entire star systems. The last survivors had lost hope until humanity's wrath fell from the sky, but they had learned that salvation sometimes came with a price that changed everything. They thought they knew about their own species,